Is my baby still there? The question left her lips before she even opened her eyes, fragile and trembling, as if the answer alone could decide whether she wanted to wake up at all. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, too bright, too clean, casting a pale glow over everything that smelled faintly of antiseptic and something colder, something clinical and distant. Chloe Whitmore lay still for a moment, her fingers twitching against the stiff hospital sheet, her body heavy in a way that didn't quite feel like pain, more like exhaustion soaked into her bones. A thin plastic bracelet pressed against her wrist, unfamiliar and unwelcome, while the steady rhythm of a monitor nearby filled the silence with quiet beeps that felt louder than they should. She swallowed, her throat dry, and tried again, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Please, can someone tell me if my baby is okay?" The words hung in the air, fragile and urgent, as a nurse stepped into view, her movements calm, practiced, reassuring in a way that almost made Chloe believe everything would be fine. Almost. 6 hours earlier, Chloe had been standing at the edge of a room she didn't belong in, balancing a tray of champagne flutes while the low murmur of polite laughter drifted through the air like something she wasn't meant to touch. The charity gala was held in one of Sydney's most expensive waterfront venues, all glass walls and soft golden lighting, where the harbor shimmered outside like a painting she could never afford. Her uniform was neat but worn at the seams, her blonde hair tied back in a simple knot that couldn't quite hide the exhaustion beneath her eyes. She kept her head down, moving carefully between guests dressed in tailored suits and designer gowns, each step measured, each breath steady, because one mistake here could cost her the shift she desperately needed. "Watch it," someone muttered as she passed too close, and Chloe immediately apologized, her voice soft, practiced, used to shrinking herself to fit spaces that never welcomed her. She told herself it didn't matter. It never mattered. Not when rent was due, not when the balance in her account barely stretched past a few dollars, not when she had something far more important to protect. Her hand moved instinctively to her coat pocket, brushing against the folded piece of paper hidden inside. The ultrasound. She hadn't meant to bring it with her, but leaving it behind had felt wrong somehow, like stepping out without a part of herself. She hadn't told anyone. Not yet. Not when she wasn't even sure how she was going to manage the next week, let alone the months ahead. The room shifted slightly as a ripple of attention spread across the guests, and Chloe glanced up just long enough to see him enter. Ethan Hawthorne didn't need an introduction. The way people turned toward him said enough. Tall, composed, every movement deliberate. He carried the kind of presence that made space for itself without asking. His dark suit fit perfectly, understated but unmistakably expensive, and there was something in the way he held himself, calm, controlled, distant, that made people lean in without realizing it. Chloe's breath caught for a fraction of a second before she looked away, focusing on the tray in her hands. It didn't matter that she recognized him. It didn't matter that once, in a different moment that felt like it belonged to another life, she had stood much closer than this. That life was gone. She had made sure of it. "You're daydreaming." A voice snapped near her, sharp enough to pull her back. Chloe blinked and adjusted her grip, stepping forward again just as someone brushed past her shoulder. The movement was small, but enough. A glass tipped. Then another. The soft clink of crystal against marble echoed louder than it should have, and Chloe's heart dropped as she quickly crouched to gather the fallen pieces, murmuring apologies that blurred together under her breath. She reached for the last glass, her fingers trembling slightly, and that was when she saw it, just a few steps away, a polished black shoe stopping mid-stride. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. She felt it instead, a shift in the air, a pause that stretched just a little too long. "Are you all right?" The voice was low, steady, unfamiliar in its gentleness, and Chloe's chest tightened before she forced herself to nod, keeping her gaze lowered. "Yes, sir. I'm fine." She gathered the last piece and stood quickly, her movements careful, controlled, as if nothing had happened. But something had, because when she turned to leave, the edge of her coat caught slightly, and the folded ultrasound slipped halfway out of her pocket before she caught it just in time. For a second, it was visible. For a second, it existed in the open air between them. And though she didn't look back, she felt it. The moment he noticed. The moment something in his world shifted, even if he didn't yet understand why. Chloe stepped out into the night soon after, the cool air brushing against her skin as she exhaled slowly, her hand pressing protectively against her coat pocket. The harbor lights flickered in the distance, beautiful and unreachable, as she started walking, each step steady despite the quiet ache in her body. She didn't hear the car until it was too late to react. She only felt the sudden rush of movement, the sharp intake of breath, and the overwhelming instinct to turn, to shield, to protect what mattered most. And then, darkness. Now, back under the fluorescent lights, Chloe's fingers curled slightly against the sheet, her breathing shallow as the memory slipped through her like something half-formed. The nurse's voice broke through gently, grounding her. "Your baby is stable," she said, her tone calm, certain, the kind of certainty Chloe clung to without question. Tears slipped quietly from the corners of her eyes, relief hitting her all at once, soft and overwhelming. But just beyond the door, unseen and silent, Ethan Hawthorne stood still, a single piece of paper held in his hand. The ultrasound, the date printed clearly beneath the image. And for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about deals or deadlines or the weight of the empire he carried. He was thinking about a single moment in time, a moment he had never forgotten, and the impossible realization that maybe, just maybe, he had been part of something far more important than he ever knew. The hallway outside the hospital room felt colder than it should have, the kind of cold that did not come from the air conditioning but from the silence that settled between every passing footstep and every distant hum of medical equipment. And Ethan Hawthorne stood there without moving, his fingers tightening slightly around the thin sheet of paper as if it carried more weight than it possibly could. The ultrasound image faint under the harsh fluorescent light, the black and white shapes blurred and unfamiliar to anyone who did not know what they were looking for. But the date printed beneath it was sharp, undeniable, cutting through his thoughts with a precision he was not prepared for. And for a moment he closed his eyes, not to escape it, but to steady himself against the realization that had arrived without warning and refused to leave, because the date did not just mark a medical detail. It marked a night he had replayed more times than he would ever admit, a night that had ended without answers, without closure, and most of all without her. And now the quiet certainty of numbers on a page suggested something he had never allowed himself to consider, not once, not in all the months that followed her disappearance. Not even when questions lingered at the edge of his mind like unfinished sentences, because he had chosen logic, distance, control, all the things that had built his life and protected it. And yet here he was, standing in a hospital corridor holding a truth that did not care about any of that. "Sir." Marcus Vale's voice broke gently through the silence, careful but steady, and Ethan opened his eyes, the composure returning to his expression in a way that looked effortless but felt anything but. "The doctor is waiting to speak with you," Marcus added, glancing briefly at the paper in Ethan's hand before looking away again, respectful, discreet, as he had always been, and Ethan nodded once, folding the ultrasound slowly, deliberately, before slipping it back into the thin envelope it had come from, his movements controlled, precise, the way they always were. When something threatened to disrupt the balance he relied on, "What do we know?" he asked, his voice even, measured, giving nothing away, and Marcus stepped slightly closer, lowering his tone. "Her name is Chloe Whitmore, 26, no listed emergency contact, brought in about 40 minutes ago after a traffic incident. She was conscious when paramedics arrived but disoriented. The doctors are monitoring both her and the baby." The word lingered just slightly longer than the rest, subtle but impossible to ignore, and Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he turned toward the consultation room. Each step steady despite the tension building beneath the surface, the door closing softly behind them as Dr. Amelia Hart looked up from the chart in her hands, her expression professional but not unkind. "Mr. Hawthorne," she acknowledged, clearly aware of who he was without needing an introduction, though there was no change in her tone, no shift in her demeanor that suggested anything other than focus on the patient, and Ethan appreciated that more than he would say. "How is she?" he asked without preamble, and the doctor nodded slightly. "She is stable, which is a good sign. There are no immediate complications, but we will need to keep her under observation for the next 24 hours to be certain, especially given her condition." She paused briefly, choosing her words with care. She is approximately 16 weeks pregnant, and while the baby's vitals are currently within a safe range, any trauma requires careful monitoring. Ethan listened without interrupting, absorbing each detail with the same focus he applied to boardroom briefings and financial reports. But this was different, the information settling somewhere deeper, somewhere less structured, and when the doctor finished, there was a brief silence before he spoke again. Has she said anything? Dr. Hart glanced down at her notes before answering. She regained consciousness briefly. Her first concern was the baby, which is understandable. She has not provided any additional information yet. She seemed anxious, but that is to be expected. Ethan nodded once, his gaze shifting momentarily toward the door as if he could see through it, as if distance alone could not separate him from the room where Chloe lay. And for a second something flickered beneath his usual composure, something quieter, more uncertain, before it was gone again, replaced by the calm authority he was known for. Make sure she has everything she needs, he said, his tone firm but not demanding. Any specialist, any additional care, arrange it. Dr. Hart studied him for a moment, perhaps recognizing the weight behind the request, before nodding. Of course, and as the meeting concluded, Ethan stepped back into the hallway. The sound of the monitor from Chloe's room faint but steady, a quiet reminder that she was there, that this was real, and not something he could set aside or postpone. Marcus remained a step behind him, silent, waiting, until Ethan spoke again, this time lower, more deliberate. Find out everything, he said, not looking back. How she ended up here, where she has been, who she has been with. I want a full report. Marcus inclined his head, already reaching for his phone. Yes, sir. And as he moved away to carry out the instructions, Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the closed door, his reflection faint in the glass panel beside it. The man looking back at him as composed and controlled as ever, but for the first time in a long time, that control felt incomplete, like something essential had been missing all along without him realizing it. And now, standing just a few steps away from the answer, he was no longer certain he wanted to keep his distance, because inside that room was not just a woman from his past, not just a question left unresolved, but something that had the power to change everything he thought he understood about his own life. And for the first time, Ethan Hawthorne did not walk away from it. The first thing Chloe noticed when she opened her eyes again was the quiet, not the kind that felt peaceful, but the kind that made every small sound seem too loud. The steady beeping of the monitor, the faint rustle of fabric when she shifted slightly against the hospital bed. And for a moment she stayed still, her hand instinctively moving to her abdomen, her breath catching as she waited for something she could not quite define, until the memory returned all at once, sharp and disorienting. The rain, the street, the sudden rush of movement, and her voice came out before she could stop it, softer this time, but no less urgent. My baby. The words barely left her lips when she noticed she was not alone, and her gaze shifted slowly toward the chair beside her bed, where Ethan Hawthorne sat, his posture straight but not rigid, his presence quiet in a way that did not belong to the world she had seen him in before. And for a second she thought she was imagining it, because nothing about this moment made sense. Not the hospital, not the silence, and certainly not him being there. You're awake, he said, his voice calm, measured, but there was something beneath it, something that did not quite match the controlled tone he used in every other situation, and Chloe blinked, her mind struggling to catch up with what she was seeing. What are you doing here? The question came out more fragile than she intended, and she immediately looked away, her fingers tightening slightly against the thin blanket, as if grounding herself in something real, something she could control. Ethan did not answer right away, and the pause stretched just long enough to make her uneasy before he finally spoke. You were brought in after an accident. I was nearby, he said simply, leaving out everything that did not fit neatly into that explanation, and Chloe nodded. Faintly, though the answer did not settle anything inside her, because there was something else, something unspoken that hung in the air between them, something she could feel even if she did not yet understand it. The baby? She asked again, her voice quieter now, almost afraid of the answer, and Ethan's gaze shifted briefly to where her hand rested protectively, then back to her face, stable, he said, and the words seemed to steady her more than anything else, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Thank you," she whispered, though she was not entirely sure what she was thanking him for being there, for telling her, or for something deeper she had not yet allowed herself to acknowledge. The silence returned, but this time it felt heavier, filled with questions neither of them had asked yet, and Chloe could feel it building, the weight of it pressing against her chest, until she could not ignore it any longer. "You should not be here," she said finally, her voice steadier now, more controlled, as if she had found the strength to put distance back where it belonged. Ethan did not move, did not look away, and when he spoke, his tone was quieter, but firmer. "I think I should." And that was when Chloe looked at him properly, really looked, and saw something she had not expected, not the composed CO she remembered, not the man who had walked away without explanation, but someone who seemed uncertain, if only for a moment, and it unsettled her more than anything else could have. "Why?" she asked, and the question lingered, unanswered, until Ethan reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed the envelope on the small table beside her bed, the movement deliberate, careful, as if he understood the significance of what he was about to reveal. Without needing to say it out loud, Chloe's eyes followed the motion, her breath catching slightly as she recognized the thin paper, the edges worn from being folded and unfolded too many times, and her hand moved instinctively toward it before she stopped herself, her gaze flickering back to his, searching, questioning, and then she understood, not fully, not completely, but enough to feel the ground shift beneath her. "You saw it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, and Ethan nodded. Once, the silence between them deepening. "The date," he added, and that was all it took. Chloe closed her eyes briefly, the tension in her chest tightening, because there were things she had buried, things she had chosen not to face, and now they were here, undeniable, impossible to ignore. "It does not mean anything," she said quickly, the words coming out sharper than she intended, defensive, protective, because that was what she had learned to be. "You should not assume. I am not assuming." Ethan interrupted gently, not raising his voice, but not allowing her to dismiss it either. "I am asking." And the difference between the two hung in the air, quiet but significant. Chloe's fingers curled slightly against the blanket, her thoughts racing, because this was exactly what she had tried to avoid, exactly what she had run from. Not the past itself, but the possibility of it catching up to her in a way she could not control. "There is nothing to ask," she said, her tone softer now, but still firm. "It is my responsibility, mine alone." Ethan watched her for a moment, studying the way she held herself, the way she created distance even when she was the one lying in a hospital bed, vulnerable in ways she refused to show, and something shifted in his expression, something quieter, more deliberate. "You left," he said finally, not accusing, not harsh, just stating a fact that had never been resolved. Chloe's eyes flickered, the words landing harder than she expected, and for a second she did not respond, because there were too many things behind that simple statement, too many memories, too many unanswered questions. "I had my reasons," she said eventually, her voice low, controlled, but there was a trace of something else beneath it, something that had not fully healed. Ethan nodded slightly, as if he had expected that answer, as if he had already considered it, and when he spoke again, his voice was steady, but there was no distance left in it. "Then tell me," he said, and for the first time since she had opened her eyes, Chloe felt something she had not prepared for, not fear, not anger, but the unsettling possibility that the past she had tried to leave behind was not finished with her yet, and that this time, walking away might not be as simple as it once had been. Chloe did not answer immediately, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before, as if the room itself was waiting for something to break, something to give way. But she kept her gaze fixed on the thin blanket beneath her fingers, tracing the faint crease in the fabric as though it could anchor her, as though it could keep everything from unraveling all at once. Because the truth was not something she had prepared to say out loud, not here, not now, not to him. And yet the past had a way of finding its own voice when it was cornered. It would not change. "Anything," she said finally, her tone controlled, almost calm, but there was a quiet strain beneath it that betrayed how much effort it took to hold that composure together. Ethan remained still, his attention unwavering, the kind that did not pressure but did not retreat either. And for the first time, Chloe felt the weight of being seen in a way she had spent months avoiding. "You do not know that," he replied, his voice low, steady. And there was no accusation in it, only certainty, the kind that came from someone who had already decided this conversation mattered. Chloe let out a small breath, one that trembled just slightly before she steadied it, her hand shifting unconsciously to rest over her abdomen again, a protective gesture she did not notice she was making. "You made it clear you did not want anything complicated," she said, her words measured but direct now, her gaze finally lifting to meet his. And there was something in her eyes that had not been there before, not fear, not hesitation, but something closer to resolve. "And I believed you." The statement landed quietly, but it carried more than just words. It carried the memory of a moment neither of them had revisited until now. Ethan's expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way most people would notice, but there was a subtle shift, a tightening at the edge of his jaw, a flicker of something that looked uncomfortably like recognition. "That is not how I remember it," he said, and Chloe almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was exactly what she had expected. "Of course you do not," she replied, her voice softer now, but edged with something deeper, something that had been buried too long. "You were not the one standing in that office, being told it would be better for everyone if you disappeared." The words hung in the air, quiet but unmistakable, and for the first time Ethan's composure faltered, not visibly, not entirely, but enough that the silence that followed felt different, sharper, more focused. "Who told you that?" he asked, and there was something in his tone now, something more urgent, more personal, and Chloe hesitated, just for a second, before answering. "Your office," she said simply. "Your assistant at the time." She did not need to say the name. The implication was enough. Ethan's mind moved quickly, pieces falling into place with a clarity he had not expected, and a faint crease appeared between his brows as he processed it, because the version of events he had accepted, the one he had built his understanding around, no longer aligned with what he was hearing now. "I never asked anyone to say that," he said, and this time there was no distance in his voice, no carefully measured tone, just a straightforward statement that carried more weight than anything he had said so far. Chloe studied him, searching his face for something, for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that he might not mean what he was saying, but she did not find it, and that unsettled her more than if he had denied everything outright. "Then why did you not come after me?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it, raw in a way she had not intended. And the moment it was spoken, she felt the shift again, the past pressing closer, the distance she had built beginning to thin. Ethan did not answer immediately, and for a second Chloe thought he would not answer at all. But then he spoke, quieter now, more deliberate. "Because I was told you did not want to be found," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made it clear he had believed that, not as an excuse, not as a justification, but as a fact he had accepted. Chloe's breath caught, the realization settling slowly, painfully, because it was not just a misunderstanding. It was something deeper, something that had been shaped and guided without either of them knowing. "So you just let it go," she said, not accusing, not entirely. But the question was there all the same, and Ethan's gaze did not waver. "I should not have," he admitted, and the simplicity of the words made them land harder than anything else could have. The room fell quiet again, but this time it was different, not heavy, not suffocating, but filled with something fragile, something that had not been there before, the possibility that neither of them had all the answers they thought they did. Chloe looked down again, her hand still resting where it had been, and for a moment she said nothing, because the truth she had held on to for so long no longer felt as certain as it once had, and that was almost harder to face than the pain itself. "It does not change what is happening now," she said eventually, her voice softer, less guarded, but still firm, and Ethan followed her gaze briefly before looking back at her, understanding more than she had said out loud. "No," he agreed. "Does not." But then he added, after a pause that felt intentional, "But it changes what happens next." Chloe looked at him again, really looked this time, and there was something in his expression she had not seen before, not in the past, not even earlier today, something steady, something certain in a way that did not feel distant or detached, but present, grounded, and for the first time since she had woken up, Chloe felt something shift inside her, not completely, not enough to erase everything that had come before, but enough to make her hesitate before pushing him away again, enough to make her wonder, just for a moment, whether this time the story between them might not end the same way it had before. Chloe let his words settle in the quiet space between them, her gaze lingering on his face as though she was trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the one she had spent months trying to forget. And for the first time since the conversation began, she did not immediately pull away, but the instinct to protect herself was still there, woven into every breath she took, every thought she tried to steady. "What happens next is not something you get to decide," she said, her voice calm but resolute. And though it was not said with anger, it carried the quiet strength of someone who had learned to stand alone even when it was difficult. Ethan did not react immediately, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the way he leaned slightly forward, not imposing, not forceful, just present in a way that made it clear he was not stepping back this time. "I am not trying to decide for you," he replied, his tone measured. "I am asking to be part of it." The words were simple, but they landed with a weight Chloe had not expected, because this was not the language she remembered from him, not the distance, not the controlled detachment that had defined their last conversation. This was something else, something quieter but more certain, and it unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. "You cannot just appear now and say that," she said, her fingers tightening slightly against the blanket as she spoke. "You were not there when things were falling apart. You were not there when I had to figure out how to keep going." Her voice did not rise, but it deepened, the emotion beneath it no longer entirely hidden. Ethan listened without interrupting, his gaze steady, absorbing every word without deflection, without excuse. And when she finished, there was a brief pause before he responded. "You are right," he said, and the acknowledgement was immediate, without hesitation. "I was not there." Chloe blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the response, because she had expected resistance, justification, something that would allow her to hold on to the distance she had built, but he did not give her that. "And I cannot change that," he continued, his voice still calm, but there was something deeper beneath it now, something that did not retreat. "But I can decide what I do now." The quiet certainty in his tone made it clear that this was not a passing thought, not something said in the moment, but something he had already accepted. Chloe looked away, her gaze falling to the envelope still resting on the table, the ultrasound hidden inside it. The truth neither of them had fully spoken, but both understood, and for a moment she said nothing, because part of her wanted to believe him, wanted to let that certainty mean something, but another part held back, cautious, unwilling to risk the same kind of hurt again. "You do not even know if it is yours," she said finally, her voice softer now, but still guarded. And Ethan's response came without hesitation. "I know the date," he said, and there was no doubt in his tone, no room for uncertainty. "And I know what that means." Chloe closed her eyes briefly, the tension in her chest tightening again, because this was the part she had tried not to face, the part she had convinced herself she could handle alone. "Knowing does not make it simple," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper now, and Ethan nodded slightly. "No," he agreed. "It does not." The agreement was quiet, but it carried understanding rather than dismissal, and for a moment the room felt still again. The steady rhythm of the monitor grounding everything in something real, something present, until Chloe shifted slightly, wincing just enough for him to notice, though she tried to hide it. And before she could say anything, Ethan was already on his feet, pressing the call button beside her bed with a calm efficiency that spoke of habit, of taking control in moments where others might hesitate. The nurse arrived quickly, her tone reassuring as she checked Chloe's vitals, adjusted the position of the bed, and offered a gentle explanation about the discomfort being normal under the circumstances. Chloe nodded faintly, grateful for the distraction, for the momentary break from the conversation that had begun to feel too close, too real. And as the nurse finished and stepped out again, the room settled back into quiet. But something had shifted, something subtle but undeniable. because the distance between them was no longer as wide as it had been, even if neither of them had fully acknowledged it yet. Chloe looked at him again, her expression softer now, less guarded than before, though the uncertainty had not disappeared entirely. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, the question simple, but filled with something deeper, something that had been building beneath everything else. Ethan did not answer immediately, his gaze holding hers as though he was choosing his words carefully, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but no less certain. "Because I should have asked more questions back then," he said. "Because I should not have accepted silence as an answer." He paused briefly, the weight of the past settling into the space between them. "And because walking away from this now would be the same mistake." Twice, Chloe felt something shift again, not enough to erase the doubt, not enough to undo the months she had spent rebuilding her life without him, but enough to make her hesitate before pushing him away again, enough to make her question whether this time might be different. And though she did not say anything in that moment, the way her gaze lingered just a fraction longer, the way her shoulders relaxed just slightly, was enough to tell Ethan that for the first time, she was not entirely. Closing the door, the night settled quietly outside the hospital windows, the distant glow of city lights reflecting softly against the glass as the steady rhythm of machines continued their quiet work inside the room. And Chloe lay there with her eyes open, not asleep, but not fully awake either, caught somewhere in between as her thoughts circled the same questions again and again, each one leading to another she was not ready to answer, her hand still resting over her abdomen as though it was the only thing keeping her grounded, the only certainty in a day that had shifted too much too quickly. And across the room Ethan remained where he had been, not speaking, not interrupting the silence, but not leaving either, his presence steady in a way that did not demand attention yet refused to fade into the background. And it was that presence more than anything else that made it impossible for Chloe to pretend none of this was happening. Because if he had left, if he had simply walked away as he had before, it would have been easier to return to the version of reality she had built for herself, the one where she was alone and prepared for it, the one where she did not have to question whether things could have been different. But he had not left, and that changed everything. Even if she did not want it to. "You should go," she said eventually, her voice quiet but clear, breaking the stillness that had settled between them. Ethan looked up from where his gaze had been resting on the faint reflection of the monitor lights, his expression calm, unreadable. "It is late," she added, as if the time itself was reason enough, as if that could create distance where none seemed to exist anymore. He glanced briefly toward the window, the darkness outside confirming what she had said, before his attention returned to her. "I am not leaving," he replied, not stubborn, not forceful, just certain, and the simplicity of the statement made it difficult to argue with. Chloe exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening slightly against the blanket. "You cannot stay here all night," she said, though there was less conviction in her tone now, less resistance than before, and Ethan's response came just as steady as before. "I can," he said, and something in the way he said it made it clear that this was not about proving a point, not about winning an argument, but about something he had already decided, something that no longer depended on her approval. Chloe turned her head slightly, looking away from him, because meeting his gaze felt too close, too revealing, and she was not ready for that. Not yet. Not when everything still felt uncertain, but the quiet stretched again, and this time it did not feel as heavy as before, more like something waiting, something unresolved but no longer unbearable, until the soft knock at the door broke through, and Marcus stepped inside, his movements careful, respectful of the space he was entering. "Sir," he said quietly, glancing briefly at Chloe before focusing on Ethan. "I have the information you requested." Ethan stood slowly, his posture straightening slightly as he stepped away from the bed, though his attention did not fully leave Chloe. "Give us a moment," he said, his tone low, and Marcus nodded, stepping back toward the hallway. And for a second Chloe hesitated, because she knew what that meant, knew that whatever he had found would bring answers she had not been ready to face. But before she could stop herself, she spoke. "You can say it here," her voice softer now, but steady, and both men paused, Ethan studying her for a brief moment before giving a small nod, and Marcus stepped back inside, closing the door gently behind him. Miss Whitmore has been working part-time at several venues over the past few months. He began, his tone professional, neutral. No fixed contract, mostly casual shifts. Her previous address shows she moved out approximately 3 months ago, currently listed at a temporary rental in Parramatta. Chloe felt a slight tightening in her chest at hearing her life reduced to a series of facts. But she did not interrupt, her gaze fixed ahead. There are no close family contacts listed. Marcus continued. Her mother passed away 2 years ago. No record of a father, and no known partner. The last detail lingered slightly longer than the rest, and the room fell quiet again. Because what had been unspoken before was now laid out clearly, undeniably. Ethan's gaze shifted briefly to Chloe, taking in the way she remained still, composed despite the weight of what had just been said, and something in his expression softened, just slightly. "Thank you, Marcus," he said, and Marcus nodded once before stepping out again, leaving the door to close quietly behind him. The silence that followed was different now, not uncertain, not questioning, but filled with a clarity that had not been there before. Chloe let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, though the vulnerability of the moment lingered. "You did not have to do that," she said, not accusing, not entirely. But the question was there, why he had chosen to look into her life, why he had chosen to stay. Ethan did not move closer, did not close the space between them physically, but his voice carried something that did. Something that bridged the distance in a way that words alone rarely could. "I needed to understand," he said simply, and Chloe looked at him again, really looked, and for the first time she did not see the man who had walked away, did not see the version of him she had held on to out of hurt and disappointment. She saw someone who was choosing to stay, not because it was easy, not because it was expected, but because he believed he should, and that realization settled quietly within her, not erasing the past, not resolving everything at once, but shifting. Something deeper, something that made the silence between them feel less like an ending and more like the beginning of something neither of them had planned, but neither of them were walking away from. The hours moved quietly through the night, measured not by clocks but by the steady rhythm of Chloe's breathing and the soft glow of the monitor beside her. And though her body remained still, her mind refused to settle, replaying fragments of the past with a clarity that felt almost cruel, as if the silence had given them permission to return without restraint. And across the room, Ethan had not changed his position much. His jacket folded neatly over the back of the chair, his sleeves rolled just enough to reveal the absence of the usual distance he carried with him. And for the first time in years, he was not surrounded by assistants, meetings, or decisions that could be calculated and controlled. He was simply there, waiting, present in a way that demanded nothing yet meant everything. Chloe shifted slightly, the faint rustle of the sheet breaking the stillness, and though she did not look at him, she knew he noticed, because that was something she remembered clearly, even from before, the way he paid attention to details others overlooked. "You are not used to this, are you?" she said quietly, her voice cutting gently through the silence, and Ethan's gaze lifted toward her, a faint hint of something almost resembling a smile touching his expression. "Not particularly," he admitted, his tone calm, and Chloe let out a soft breath that could have been a quiet laugh if there had been more strength behind it. "You used to leave before things became complicated," she added, the words slipping out before she could stop them, and for a moment the air shifted again, not tense, but heavier with meaning. Ethan did not deny it, did not look away, and when he spoke, his voice carried a steadiness that had not been there before. "That was a mistake," he said simply, and the honesty in the statement made Chloe pause, because it was not something she had expected to hear, not like this, not without defense or explanation. And for a moment she did not respond, her thoughts moving carefully around the words as if testing them for truth. "You say that now," she said eventually, her tone softer, less guarded than before, but still cautious, and Ethan nodded slightly, accepting the distance in her response without challenging it. "I should have said it then," he replied, and the quiet certainty in his voice made it difficult to dismiss. Chloe turned her head slightly, her gaze drifting toward the window where the first hint of dawn was beginning to soften the darkness, a faint line of light stretching across the horizon, subtle but undeniable, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Because something about that light made the silence feel different, less like something to avoid and more like something to understand. I did not leave because I wanted to, Chloe said suddenly, her voice low, almost as if she was speaking more to herself than to him. And Ethan's attention sharpened instantly, not interrupting, not pushing, just listening in a way that made it easier for her to continue. I left because I thought it was already decided for me, she added, her fingers tightening slightly against the sheet as she spoke, and the words seemed to settle into the space between them, with a weight that could not be ignored. Ethan leaned forward slightly, not closing the distance entirely, but enough to show he was there, fully present in the moment. It was not, he said, his voice steady, and Chloe looked at him again, searching for something she had not found before, something that could confirm or deny everything she had believed. You cannot change what I was told, she said, and there was no accusation in her tone now, just a quiet statement of fact, and Ethan nodded, once, acknowledging it without hesitation. No, he agreed, but I can make sure it does not happen again. The words were simple, but they carried a promise that did not need to be emphasized. Chloe studied him for a moment longer, her expression unreadable, because part of her wanted to believe that, wanted to accept that this time would be different, but another part still held back, cautious, unwilling to trust something that had once slipped away so easily. You do not know how much has changed, she said, her voice softer now, less defensive, and Ethan's response came just as quietly. Then tell me, he said, echoing the words from before. But this time they felt different, not like a question waiting for an answer, but like an invitation she could choose to accept or refuse. Chloe looked down again, her hand resting protectively where it had been, the steady rise and fall of her breathing the only constant she could rely on. And for a moment she hesitated, because telling him meant opening a door she had kept firmly closed, meant allowing him to see the parts of her life she had rebuilt without him, the parts she was not sure she was ready to share. But the silence stretched, and this time it did not feel like pressure. It felt like space she could fill if she chose to. I stopped waiting, she said finally, her voice quiet but clear, and the words carried more than just their meaning. They carried months of quiet decisions, of learning to rely on herself, of letting go of something she had once thought would last. Ethan did not react immediately, did not interrupt, and when he spoke, his tone remained steady, but there was something deeper beneath it, something that had not been there before. And now, he asked, the question simple, but filled with something more. Chloe lifted her gaze to meet his, and for a moment the distance between them felt smaller than it had all night. Now I do not know, she admitted, and the honesty in her voice was quiet but unmistakable. And in that moment, with the first light of morning beginning to fill the room, neither of them had the answers they were searching for, but for the first time, they were both still there, not walking away, not choosing silence, but staying in the uncertainty together, and somehow, that felt like more than either of them had expected. The morning light continued to grow, soft and pale at first, then slowly filling the hospital room with a quiet warmth that made everything feel more real, more grounded, and Chloe lay still as she watched it spread across the floor, across the edge of the bed, until it reached her hands, resting gently where she had kept them all night. And for a moment, she focused only on that, on the simple fact that she was still here, that her breathing was steady, that the life she carried was still safe, because that had been her only priority for so long that everything else had become secondary, something she could push aside, something she did not have to face, until now, until he was sitting just a few feet away, no longer a memory she could reshape or avoid, but a presence she had to acknowledge. And she felt it again, that quiet shift inside her, the one that made it harder to pretend nothing had changed. You have not slept, she said without looking at him, her voice soft, but clear enough to break the stillness, and Ethan glanced briefly at the window before returning his attention to her. Neither have you, he replied, and there was a faint trace of something lighter in his tone, something that did not quite reach a smile, but softened the edges of the moment. Chloe exhaled quietly, her gaze still fixed ahead. I am used to it, she said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more than she intended, because it spoke of nights spent worrying, planning, counting every dollar, every decision, every possibility, and Ethan heard it, Not just the words, but what they meant beneath the surface. "You should not have had to be," he said. And this time there was no hesitation in his voice, no distance, just a quiet certainty that felt unfamiliar and yet difficult to ignore. Chloe turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment before shifting away again, because holding that gaze for too long felt like standing too close to something she did not fully understand. "That is not how things work," she replied, her tone gentle, not dismissive, just honest, and Ethan nodded once, accepting the reality of it even if he did not agree with it, because there were parts of her life he had not been there for, parts he could not undo. And for a moment the silence returned, but it was no longer heavy, no longer filled with unspoken tension. It felt quieter now, more balanced, until the soft knock at the door broke through again, and Dr. Amelia Hart stepped inside, her expression calm and professional as she approached the bed. "Good morning, Chloe," she said gently, checking the monitor with practiced ease. "How are you feeling?" Chloe hesitated for a moment before answering, not because she did not know, but because the question felt larger than it should have. "Better," she said finally, her voice steady, and the doctor nodded, making a note on the chart before glancing briefly at Ethan, acknowledging his presence without comment. "We would like to run another scan this morning, just to be certain everything remains stable," she explained, her tone reassuring, and Chloe nodded, her hand instinctively resting where it always did now, a quiet habit she had not noticed forming. "That is fine," she said, and the doctor smiled faintly. "It should not take long," she added, before stepping back, giving them space again, and as the door closed softly behind her, the room returned to its quiet rhythm. But something had shifted once more, because the next step was no longer theoretical, no longer something they could avoid discussing. It was real, immediate, and Chloe felt it in the way her breathing changed, just slightly, in the way her thoughts began to move faster, more uncertain. "You do not have to come," she said after a moment, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant, and Ethan looked at her, studying the way she spoke, the way she created distance even as the situation drew them closer. "I am coming," he replied, and there was no question in his tone, no room for argument. And Chloe almost protested, almost reminded him again that this was not his responsibility, that she had managed on her own until now, but the words did not come, because something in his certainty made it harder to push him away, not impossible, but harder than before. And instead she simply nodded once, a small acknowledgement that felt larger than it should have, because it was the first time she had not resisted, the first time she had allowed him to remain without questioning it. And the quiet that followed was different again, softer, less guarded, as if something had eased between them without either of them fully realizing it, until the nurse returned with a wheelchair, her movements efficient but gentle as she prepared Chloe for the scan, and Ethan stepped aside just enough to give them space, but not far, never far, his presence still there, steady, constant, and as Chloe was carefully guided from the bed, her feet touching the floor for the first time since she had arrived. She felt the slight unsteadiness beneath her, the unfamiliar sensation of moving after hours of stillness, and before she could adjust, Ethan was there, not touching her, not overstepping, but close enough that she could feel the support without needing to ask for it. And for a moment she hesitated, her gaze flickering toward him, uncertain, but he did not speak, did not push, he simply stayed. And that was enough. She allowed the nurse to guide her into the chair, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her fingers curling slightly as she steadied herself. And as they moved toward the door, she glanced back once, just briefly, and saw him following, not leading, not taking control, just walking beside her in a way that felt unfamiliar and yet strangely right. And in that moment, as the corridor opened ahead of them and the next step became unavoidable, Chloe realized that whatever came next, she was no longer facing it alone, and that thought, quiet and unexpected, settled within her with a weight that was not heavy, but steady, something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. The corridor felt longer than it should have, each turn marked by the soft echo of wheels against polished floors and the distant murmur of voices that never quite reached them. And Chloe sat quietly in the wheelchair, her hands resting in her lap, her fingers loosely intertwined, as if holding onto something unseen, something fragile that she did not want to lose, while the early morning light filtered through high windows, casting pale reflections along the walls, and though the hospital moved around them with quiet efficiency, she felt oddly separate from it all, as if she were moving through a space that existed just slightly outside of everything else. And beside her, Ethan walked without speaking, his pace measured to match theirs, his presence steady, unintrusive, and for once he did not feel like the center of anything. He did not draw attention or shift the atmosphere around him. He simply stayed where he was, close enough to matter but far enough to give her space. And Chloe noticed that, even if she did not say it, she noticed the way he did not take over, did not step in unless necessary. And that made it easier to breathe, easier to focus on what lay ahead rather than everything behind. "It is just routine," the nurse said gently as they reached the imaging department, her voice calm, practiced, and Chloe nodded, though the word routine felt distant, unfamiliar, because nothing about this moment felt ordinary, not the quiet tension in her chest, not the awareness of every small movement, not the knowledge that this scan would confirm something that had only existed in silence until now. The nurse guided her into the room, helping her onto the examination bed with careful, steady movements. And for a brief moment Chloe hesitated, her hand tightening slightly against the edge as she adjusted. But she said nothing, her composure holding, as it always did. Ethan remained near the doorway at first, giving her that distance again, that choice. But when her gaze flickered toward him, uncertain for just a second, he stepped forward quietly, not too close, just enough that she could see him without needing to turn her head fully. And that small gesture settled something inside her, something she had not expected to need. "You can stay," she said softly, the words almost an afterthought, but they carried more meaning than she intended, and Ethan inclined his head once, acknowledging it without comment. The technician prepared the equipment with quiet efficiency, explaining each step in a calm, reassuring tone that Chloe tried to focus on, tried to anchor herself in, but her attention kept drifting, pulled back to the reality of what this moment meant. And when the screen flickered to life, a soft glow filling the dimmed room, everything else seemed to fall away, the gentle hum of the machine, the quiet instructions. Even the presence beside her faded into the background as her gaze fixed on the image forming slowly in front of her. It was not clear at first, just shapes, shadows, movement that did not quite make sense, but then the technician adjusted something, and suddenly there it was, unmistakable in a way that made her breath catch, a small, steady rhythm visible in the center of the screen. And for a moment Chloe forgot everything else, forgot the past, the uncertainty, the conversation that had brought them here, and all she could focus on was that, the simple, undeniable proof that the life she had been protecting was real, was present, was still there. Her hand moved instinctively, resting over her abdomen again, her fingers pressing lightly as if she could feel it, as if the connection between what she saw and what she carried could somehow be bridged by touch alone. And beside her Ethan stood completely still, his gaze fixed on the screen in a way that was different from anything before. There was no calculation there, no distance, just a quiet intensity that spoke of something deeper, something he was only just beginning to understand. "Everything looks stable," the technician said gently, her voice breaking through the moment without disrupting it. And Chloe let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her shoulders relaxing slightly as relief settled in, soft but overwhelming. And though she did not look at him, she felt it, the shift beside her, the way Ethan exhaled quietly, the tension easing in a way that mirrored her own. And for a brief second, without words, they shared that moment, not as two people separated by circumstance or misunderstanding, but as two people connected by something neither of them could ignore anymore. The technician continued with the scan, pointing out small details, explaining what they were seeing in simple terms. But Chloe only half listened, her attention drifting between the screen and the quiet presence beside her, because for the first time since everything had begun, the uncertainty did not feel as overwhelming. It was still there, still present, but it was balanced now by something else, something steadier, something that did not depend on what had happened before. And when the scan was finished, the room returned slowly to its usual rhythm, the lights brightening, the equipment quieting, the moment fading into something that could be remembered rather than lived. Chloe sat up carefully, her movements slower now, more deliberate, and before she could steady herself fully, Ethan was there again, not touching, not overstepping, but close enough that she could lean into that presence if she needed to. And for a moment she did, just slightly, not enough to be obvious, not enough to change anything outwardly, but enough to acknowledge that she was no longer standing alone in this. And as the nurse guided her back into the wheelchair, her gaze lifted once more, meeting Ethan's for just a second, and in that brief exchange, something passed between them, not a promise, not a resolution, but an understanding that whatever came next, it would not be ignored, it would not be left unanswered. And as they moved back into the corridor, the world continuing around them as if nothing had changed, Chloe knew that everything had, even if she was only just beginning to understand how much. The return to the room felt quieter than before, as if the world outside had softened after what they had just seen, and Chloe sat back against the hospital bed with a careful breath, her body still adjusting to the movement, her mind still holding onto the image that had not yet faded, the small, steady rhythm that had anchored everything in a way words never could. And for a moment she closed her eyes, not to escape, but to hold on to that feeling just a little longer, because it was the first time since everything began that fear had not been the loudest thing inside her. And when she opened them again, Ethan was there, exactly where he had been before, as if he had not moved at all, as if he had been waiting for her to return not just to the room, but to herself. "You saw it," she said quietly, her voice softer now, less guarded, and Ethan nodded once, his gaze steady. "I did," he replied, and there was something different in the way he said it. Not just acknowledgement, but understanding, something deeper that had not been there before. Chloe looked down at her hands, her fingers resting lightly against each other, and for a moment she said nothing, because the words she had been holding back no longer felt as impossible to say, just difficult, just uncertain. "I was not sure I would get to see that," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper, and Ethan's expression shifted slightly, the weight of her words settling in a way that did not require explanation. "You were always going to," he said, not as reassurance, but as something closer to belief, and Chloe shook her head faintly, a small movement, but enough to show that she did not fully accept that. "Not yet. You do not understand," she said, and this time she did look at him, her gaze steady, no longer avoiding. "There were days I did not know how I would manage the next week, let alone this." The honesty in her voice was quiet, but it carried everything she had not said before, everything she had handled alone, and Ethan listened, not interrupting, not offering solutions, just hearing it in a way that made it easier for her to continue. "I had to plan everything," she went on, her fingers tightening slightly. "Where I would work, how I would save, what I would give up, and what I could not afford to lose." Her hand moved again, instinctively, resting over her abdomen, and this time she did not pull it away, did not hide it, because there was no reason to anymore, not after what they had seen. "And through all of that," she added, her voice softer now, "this was the only thing I could not risk." Ethan followed the movement of her hand, his expression steady, but there was something in his eyes now that had not been there before, something quieter, more grounded. "You did not have to do that alone," he said, and Chloe let out a small breath, something between a sigh and a quiet acknowledgement. "I thought I did," she replied, and the words lingered, because they were not just about the past. They were about everything that had led her here, everything she had believed until now. And the silence that followed was not heavy, not uncomfortable. It was reflective, as if both of them were considering the same thing from different sides. Until Ethan spoke again, his tone calm, but deliberate. "Then, do not anymore," he said, and Chloe looked at him, really looked this time, searching for something she could not name, something that would tell her whether this was just a moment or something more, and what she found was not certainty, not a guarantee, but something steady, something that did not shift under pressure, and for the first time, she did not immediately push it away. "You make it sound simple," she said, her tone softer now, not dismissive, just cautious, and Ethan gave a slight nod, acknowledging the truth in that. "It is not," he admitted, "but it does not have to be impossible." The difference between the two settled quietly between them, and Chloe considered it, not fully accepting, not fully rejecting, just allowing it to exist, which in itself was a change from before. And as the morning continued to unfold outside the window, the light growing stronger, more certain, she found herself less focused on what had gone wrong and more on what might still be possible, even if she was not ready to define it yet, even if she was not ready to trust it completely, because something had shifted, something she could not ignore, and though she did not say it out loud, the way she no longer turned away, the way she allowed the silence to exist without filling it with distance, was enough to show that for the first time since she had woken up, she was not just holding on to what she had lost, she was beginning, slowly, to consider what she might still have. The room had grown quieter as the morning settled fully into place, the early rush of hospital activity fading into a steady rhythm that felt almost predictable, and Chloe sat slightly upright now, the pillow adjusted behind her back, her breathing even, though her thoughts remained anything but, because what had shifted between them was no longer something she could ignore, not after everything that had been said, not after everything they had seen. And across from her Ethan stood near the window, his posture relaxed but not distant, his attention never fully leaving her even when his gaze drifted outward for a moment, as if he was balancing two realities at once, the one he had always known and the one unfolding now. "You should go back to your office," Chloe said after a while, her voice calm, almost practical, and though the words sounded like a suggestion, there was a familiar edge to them, the same instinct that had guided her before, the need to create space, to regain control over something that felt too uncertain. Ethan turned slightly at her voice, his expression unchanged, steady in a way that made it difficult to read. "I will go when you are discharged," he replied, and Chloe frowned faintly, not in frustration, but in disbelief. "That could be tomorrow, or the next day," she said, and Ethan gave a small nod. "Then I will adjust accordingly." The simplicity of his response made it clear that this was not something he considered negotiable, and Chloe let out a quiet breath, her gaze shifting briefly away before returning to him. "You cannot just rearrange everything like that," she said, her tone softer now, less resistant, but still holding onto logic, onto the structure she understood, and Ethan stepped a little closer, not too close, but enough that his presence felt more immediate, more deliberate. "I already have," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no sign that this was anything other than a decision he had made without doubt. Chloe studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable, because part of her wanted to challenge it, wanted to remind him of everything he was responsible for, everything that should have taken priority, but another part, quieter and more uncertain, held back, because she could not ignore what that choice meant. Not anymore. "Why?" she asked finally, the question simple but filled with everything she had not said. And Ethan did not answer immediately, his gaze holding hers as if weighing the words before speaking, not out of uncertainty, but out of care. "Because I missed something important once," he said, his voice low, steady. "And I am not doing that again." Chloe felt the words settle somewhere deeper than she expected, not as a promise she could rely on, not yet, but as something that carried intention, something that did not feel temporary. And for a moment she said nothing, because responding to that meant acknowledging it, meant allowing it to matter, and she was not sure she was ready for that. "You do not know what comes next," she said instead, her tone quieter now, less defensive, and Ethan inclined his head slightly, accepting the truth of that without hesitation. "No," he agreed. "But I know I will be here for it." The certainty in his voice was not loud, not forceful, but it did not need to be. It was steady in a way that did not shift, and Chloe looked at him again, searching for something she could hold on to, something that would make this easier to understand, but all she found was consistency, and somehow that was more unsettling than anything else, because it meant this was not a moment, not a reaction, it was a choice, and choices had consequences. "You are asking for something I do not know how to give," she said after a while, her voice softer now, the edges of resistance worn down by everything that had happened, and Ethan's response came without pause. "I am not asking you to give anything," he said. "I am asking you to let me stay." The distinction was small, but it changed everything, because it removed the pressure, removed the expectation, and left only the presence itself, and Chloe felt it. The shift in what that meant. The way it no longer felt like something she had to manage or control, but something she could allow, even if she did not fully understand it yet. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was thoughtful, as if both of them were adjusting to a reality that had not existed before, until the sound of footsteps approached and the door opened again. Dr. Hart stepping inside with the same calm professionalism as before. "Your results look good," she said, her tone reassuring as she glanced between them. "We will continue monitoring today, but if everything remains stable, we can discuss discharge tomorrow." Chloe nodded, relief settling quietly into her expression, and Ethan acknowledged the information with a slight nod of his own, but neither of them spoke immediately after, because the words that mattered had already been said. And as the doctor left, closing the door softly behind her, the room felt different again, not because anything had changed externally, but because something internal had shifted, something neither of them could ignore anymore. And Chloe realized, as she looked at him once more, that, for the first time since everything began, she was not thinking about how to do this alone. She was thinking about what it might mean not to. The day moved forward in small, quiet increments, marked not by dramatic changes, but by subtle shifts that Chloe could feel more than see. The steady hum of the hospital settling into something almost familiar as the hours passed, and she found herself watching the light move slowly across the room again, tracing the same path it had taken that morning. Only this time it felt different, less distant, less uncertain, because something within her had begun to adjust, to accept what she had been. Resisting, not completely, not without hesitation, but enough that the tension she had carried so tightly was no longer as constant as it had been, and Ethan remained there, just as he had said he would, not interrupting the rhythm of her recovery, not overwhelming the space with presence, but never stepping away, and that consistency began to settle into something she could not ignore, something she could not dismiss as temporary or situational, because time had passed, and he had not changed. His mind had not been called away, had not returned to the world she knew he belonged to. Instead, he stayed in this one, with her, and that quiet decision carried more weight than any explanation could have. "Do you ever get tired of being certain?" Chloe asked after a while, her voice soft, almost reflective, and Ethan looked up from where he had been reviewing something on his phone, his attention shifting fully back to her without delay. "I am not always certain," he replied, and Chloe raised her eyebrows slightly, a faint hint of disbelief touching her expression. "It looks like you are," she said, and there was no accusation in it, just observation. And Ethan allowed a small pause before responding, as if considering the truth in her words. "It is easier to appear that way," he admitted, and Chloe studied him for a moment, because that was not the answer she had expected, not from him, and it changed something, not dramatically, but enough to make her see him differently, not just as someone who always knew what to do, but as someone who chose how to present what he did not. And that realization made him feel less distant, less defined by the role she had once placed him in. "And now?" she asked quietly, and Ethan's gaze held hers, steady but not guarded. "Now I am certain about this," he said, and he did not need to clarify what he meant, not after everything that had been said, not after everything that had happened. Chloe felt the words settle within her, not as pressure, not as expectation, but as something that existed, regardless of what she chose to do with it. And that made it easier to accept, easier to consider without feeling overwhelmed. The silence that followed was calm, reflective, until Chloe shifted slightly, her movement slower now but more confident than before, and she reached toward the small table beside her bed, her fingers brushing lightly against the envelope that had been placed there earlier, the one that had started this entire conversation. She hesitated for a moment before opening it, unfolding the paper carefully as if it might break under too much pressure, and when she looked at it again, the image felt different, not just something she had hidden away, something she had carried alone, but something that had been seen, acknowledged, shared, and she glanced up at Ethan, her expression softer, more open than it had been before. "I was going to keep this to myself," she said quietly, and there was no regret in her tone, just honesty. "I thought it would be easier." Ethan did not interrupt, did not offer an immediate response, and that made it easier for her to continue. "Not because I did not want you to know," she added after a moment, her voice steady, but because I did not think it mattered anymore. The words lingered between them, carrying the weight of everything she had believed until now, and Ethan's response came gently, without challenge. It matters, he said, and the simplicity of it made it impossible to dismiss. Chloe looked at him for a moment, longer, then nodded faintly, as if acknowledging something she had not allowed herself to before, and carefully she folded the paper again, placing it back into the envelope, but this time her hand did not linger over it protectively. It rested there calmly, as if the need to guard it so tightly had eased, just slightly. "If I let you stay," she said slowly, choosing her words with care, "things will not go back to how they were." And Ethan nodded once, understanding immediately. "I am not asking for that," he replied, his tone steady. "I am asking for what comes next." And Chloe exhaled quietly, the tension in her shoulders easing in a way she had not expected, because for the first time the conversation was not about fixing the past, not about undoing what had already happened. It was about something new, something that had not yet been defined, and that felt different, less overwhelming, as if the weight she had been carrying was shifting into something she did not have to hold alone anymore. The light in the room had grown softer now, the afternoon settling in, and Chloe leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting toward the window again before returning to him, and for a moment she did not say anything, because the decision she was considering was not simple, not immediate, but it was no longer impossible either. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but clear. "Then stay," she said, and though the words were simple, they carried everything she had not said before, everything she had held back, everything she was now choosing to allow. And Ethan did not respond right away, did not turn it into something larger than it was. He simply inclined his head once, a quiet acknowledgement, as if he understood exactly what that meant. And in that moment, nothing else needed to be said, because the space between them had already changed, not completely, not perfectly, but enough that for the first time, neither of them was standing on opposite sides of it anymore. The afternoon faded slowly into evening, the light outside the window softening into a quiet blend of gold and gray. And Chloe sat in the same place she had been for hours, yet nothing about the moment felt the same as before, because something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, not with words, not with silence, and she could feel it in the way the room no longer felt like a place she was waiting to leave, but a place where something had begun, something fragile but real. And across from her, Ethan remained exactly as he had promised, not distant, not distracted, but present in a way that did not demand attention, yet held it all the same. And for the first time since she had woken up, Chloe did not feel the need to measure that presence, did not feel the need to question it at every moment. She simply let it exist, and that alone felt like a quiet kind of relief she had not expected. "It is strange," she said after a while, her voice soft but steady, and Ethan looked at her without hesitation, his attention immediate as always. "What is?" he asked, and Chloe glanced toward the window before answering, her gaze following the fading light. "I thought this would be the hardest part," she admitted, her fingers resting lightly over her abdomen as they had so many times before, "but it is not." Ethan did not interrupt, did not assume. He simply waited, and Chloe let out a small breath before continuing. "The hardest part was thinking I had to do everything alone," she said, and the honesty in her voice carried a quiet weight that settled between them without resistance. Ethan's expression shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough to show that he understood what she was saying, not just the words, but what they meant beneath the surface. "You are not alone anymore," he said, and the words were simple, but they did not feel like a promise that could be broken. They felt like something steadier, something that existed regardless of what came next. And Chloe looked at him, really looked this time, not searching for doubt or distance, but allowing herself to see what was there without trying to reshape it. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because the silence no longer needed to be filled. It no longer carried uncertainty or hesitation. It simply existed, and that was enough. The quiet hum of the monitor continued its steady rhythm. The world outside moved on as it always did, but inside the room something had settled into place, something neither of them had planned but both had chosen, and Chloe leaned back slightly against the pillow, her shoulders relaxing in a way that felt unfamiliar but welcome, because she was no longer holding everything on her own, not in the way she had been before, What happens after tomorrow? She asked suddenly, the question coming without hesitation this time. And Ethan did not need to ask what she meant. He understood immediately, because it was the question that had been waiting beneath everything else, the one that would define what came next. We take it one step at a time, he said, his voice calm, measured, and Chloe considered that, the simplicity of it, the absence of pressure or expectation, and it made something inside her ease again, because it meant she did not have to have all the answers now. She did not have to decide everything in a single moment. She could move forward without knowing exactly where it would lead, and for the first time that did not feel like something to fear. It felt like something she could accept. One step at a time, she repeated quietly, and there was a faint trace of something lighter in her tone, something that had not been there before, not quite a smile, but close enough to change the feeling of the room. Ethan watched her for a moment, then gave a small nod, as if acknowledging not just the words, but the decision behind them, and outside the last of the light faded completely, leaving the room bathed in a softer, quieter glow, and Chloe closed her eyes briefly, not out of exhaustion, but out of something closer to peace, something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. And when she opened them again, Ethan was still